The spreadsheets didn't lie. That was the thing about numbers. They never did. People lied. Bosses lied. Boyfriends lied with their hands on your face and their eyes full of something you mistook for love. But a column of figures, balanced or unbalanced, always told you exactly what was there. Juniper Falk had known that since she was 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in Bakersfield, while her mother cried over a stack of bills she couldn't read fast enough to understand. Juniper had read them for her. She'd sorted them by due date, by interest rate, by urgency. She'd been 9 years old, and already she understood that the world was made of numbers, and if you could read them better than everyone else, you might get out. She'd gotten out. Sort of. The morning everything changed, she was sitting at her desk on the 4th floor of Callaway Financial Partners, staring at a discrepancy that made no sense. $43,000, moved in 3 separate transfers across 6 weeks, each one just under the reporting threshold. Clean, deliberate, the kind of careful that takes practice. She'd found it by accident, pulling the quarterly audit because her actual boss, Terrence Webb, Senior VP of Operations, was too busy taking a long lunch with the clients whose accounts Juniper managed to bother doing his own job. She pulled the numbers. She ran the comparison. She flagged the discrepancy in the internal system the way she'd been trained to do. By 3 in the afternoon, she'd been called into HR. By 3:15, she'd been walked to her desk to collect her things. The woman from HR, a soft-voiced woman named Pamela, who kept touching her own lanyard like it was a rosary, explained that an investigation had been opened, that Juniper's access had been suspended pending review, that they appreciated her 4 years of service, and that HR would be in touch. Juniper stood in the parking garage with a box of her things and a mind that refused to stop calculating. She hadn't taken the money. She knew she hadn't taken it. She knew it the way she knew her own handwriting, the way she knew the particular smell of her apartment's old radiator in November. She knew her own work, and she knew, standing there in the dim concrete dark, box balanced against her hip, keys cutting into her palm, that someone had used her login credentials to move it. The only question was who had her password. She'd written it down once. In the small leather notebook she kept in her desk drawer, the one with the green cover, the one she'd stupidly and lazily labeled Pazas on the inside front page, because she'd started at Callaway right out of her accounting certificate program and hadn't known better yet. She'd stopped writing passwords down after the first year. But that notebook had stayed in the drawer, and only one person had ever opened that drawer without asking. Dominic Haas, senior associate, her boyfriend of 11 months. A man who worked on the 7th floor and sometimes came down to take her to lunch, and had, on at least 3 occasions she could remember, leaned across her desk to grab something while she was in the break room. She didn't go home right away. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 45 minutes, running the sequence in her head the way she'd run the numbers. Motive means opportunity. The transfers were too careful to be impulsive. Someone had planned this. Someone had needed a fall person, someone with access to her desk and no particular loyalty to her when things got difficult. She thought about the last 3 months, the way Dominic had seemed distracted, the way he'd started coming in earlier, the way he'd laughed a little too easily at the Christmas party when his boss had made a joke she hadn't quite caught. She thought about the transfers. 6 weeks. The first one had been placed 8 weeks ago. They'd been together 11 months. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and stayed that way for a long time. By the time she pulled out of the garage, it was dark. She drove home on autopilot, parked on the street because the lot behind her building had a broken gate that management had been promising to fix for 4 months, and carried her box up 2 flights of stairs to an apartment that smelled like the rice she'd made 2 nights ago and the candle she'd burned down to nothing last week. She set the box on the kitchen table. She looked at it. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up her bank account, and looked at that instead. $312. Rent was due in 18 days. She had approximately 6 weeks of emergency savings before things got genuinely serious. And that was assuming she ate cheap and didn't run into any surprises. She'd always assumed she'd have more time. She closed the laptop. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table, the same way she used to sit at the kitchen table in Bakersfield when she was 9, and the world was made of numbers she was learning to read, and she tried to figure out what came next. What came next, as it happened, was Harlan Voss. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know anything yet, except the particular silence of an apartment where you have just realized you are completely alone in a problem that is entirely someone else's fault. She found the job listing 3 days later. She'd been applying everywhere: accounting firms, small businesses, a non-profit that paid almost nothing but at least paid. When the listing appeared in a search she'd run so many times the results were starting to feel like wallpaper. Private financial management. Discretion required. Competitive compensation. Apply with full resume and 2 references. No company name. A P.O. box for responses. The listing had been posted 4 hours ago. Any reasonable person would have scrolled past it. Juniper clicked. The interview happened a week later in an office building in the financial district that had no visible lobby directory, just a sleek reception desk and a woman who took her name, made a call, and said someone would be right down without indicating who that someone might be. Juniper sat in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent and looked at the art on the walls and tried to remember the last time she'd been somewhere this quiet. The man who came to collect her was not who she'd expected. She'd expected a lawyer type, someone in a good suit with good shoes and the practiced smile of someone who'd done a lot of hiring. What she got was a man in his early 40s with close-cropped dark hair going grey at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had taken a few hits and remembered all of them, and a way of moving through the lobby that made the receptionist look at her phone and the security guard by the elevator straighten up without being told to. He wasn't smiling. He held the elevator for her without making a thing of it. "Falk," he said when the doors closed. Not a question, just her name, like he'd already verified it. "That's me," she said. He didn't respond to that. He looked at the elevator doors. She looked at the elevator doors. The numbers ticked upward, 14, 15, 16. "I was told the position is financial management," she said, because silence in small spaces made her say things. "Among other things. What are the other things?" He glanced at her then. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like a recalibration. Like she'd done something slightly unexpected, and he was filing it away. "Discretion," he said. "Accuracy. The ability to work with information that would make most people uncomfortable. I'm not most people." "I know," he said. "I read your file." The elevator opened. The office. His office. She understood immediately, because everything in it was arranged with the specificity of someone who did not share space easily, occupied the entire 16th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. A desk that was clean in the way only very powerful people manage, where the cleanliness itself communicates that things happen here, they just don't leave a trace. 2 chairs across from the desk that matched the chairs in the lobby. 1 chair behind it that didn't. He sat in the one that didn't. He gestured to the 2. She sat. He opened a folder on the desk and looked at it for a moment, though she had the feeling he'd already read everything in it, and the looking was something else. A pause, a choice about where to begin. "You were terminated from Callaway Financial Partners 11 days ago," he said. "I was," she said, "for misappropriation of client funds. That's what they called it." He looked up. "What would you call it?" "I'd call it someone used my credentials to move $43,000 through 3 transfers timed to avoid threshold reporting. And I found it because I was doing an audit that technically wasn't my job, and whoever set it up needed someone to land on when it was discovered." She kept her voice even. "She'd had 11 days to get even. I'd call it a setup. But I don't have the resources to prove it, so what I'm calling it publicly is a misunderstanding under investigation, and I'm hoping to be employed again before the investigation runs out my savings." He studied her for a long moment. "How much did they take?" he said. $43,212. Across 6 weeks. 3 transfers, each under $10,000 to avoid automatic flagging. The originating accounts were shell structures routed through 2 different subsidiaries. She paused. The accountant who set that up wasn't amateur. Something shifted in his face again. Harder to read this time. Neither are you, he said. No, she agreed. I'm not. His name, she learned over the following 30 minutes, was Voss. He told her this the way you'd tell someone a fact. Flatly, without embellishment, with the understanding that she should retain it. He did not offer a first name. The company, such as it was, handled private financial management for a range of clients whose needs were, as he put it, complex. He needed someone who could read numbers quickly, work without supervision, and understand implicitly that the work did not leave the building. What kind of clients? She said. The kind that pay well and expect results. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. He leaned back slightly. Do you want the answer, or do you want the job? She looked at him, at the office, at the folder with her name on it, sitting on a desk that cost more than her car. How much? She said. He named a number. She kept her face still, which took effort, because the number was more than double what she'd been making at Callaway. Monthly, he added. She looked at the desk, at the window, at the grey beginning to come in at the edges of his hair, at his hands which were resting flat on the folder, and the faint scar that ran across the back of the right one. I'll need to know what I'm signing, she said. I'll need to see an actual contract. I'll need to know what I can say to a lawyer if something goes wrong. Nothing will go wrong. Everything can go wrong. I've seen $43,000 moved through shell accounts by someone who ate lunch across from me for 11 months. I'm aware of what wrong looks like. She met his eyes. So I'll need a contract. He picked up his pen, made a note on something she couldn't see. You'll have one by tomorrow morning, he said. The contract was 12 pages long and written in language so clean it had obviously been vetted by someone who understood exactly where the edges were. She read it twice. She called a lawyer friend, her old college roommate, now practicing in Sacramento, and read her the relevant sections over the phone. Her roommate asked who the employer was. Juniper said she wasn't sure yet. Her roommate said it was tight but technically airtight, and that the compensation was, and she used the word insane, which was not a legal term but was accurate. She signed it. She started the following Monday. The work at first was what it sounded like. Financial records, accounts, the kind of numbers she knew how to read, cash flow statements, asset tables, transfer logs. Except the accounts were larger than anything she'd handled at Callaway, and some of the structures were unusual in ways she had to spend her first 2 weeks carefully mapping, and the clients never came in person. She received information. She processed it. She filed what needed to be filed and flagged what needed to be flagged, and sent her reports to an email address that she eventually understood belonged to Voss. He came to her floor 3 times in the first month. The first time, he stood in the doorway and asked if she had what she needed. She said she needed a second monitor. He had one sent up that afternoon. The second time, he came at 7 in the evening, when she was still at her desk, because she'd found something in the Q3 ledger for one of the holding companies that didn't balance. He stood behind her and looked at the screen for a while without speaking, and then he said, the 3rd line from the bottom, and she looked and saw it. An entry that had been coded wrong, input error, not fraud, but the kind of input error that compounds. She fixed it. He left. The 3rd time, he came in on a Friday afternoon and set a coffee on her desk without saying anything, and she looked at it and looked at him and said, I didn't know you knew how I take it. Black, he said. You drink it black. How do you know that? I pay attention, he said, and left. She held the coffee for a long time after he was gone, because it was warm, and because she was trying to figure out what it meant that the most opaque, unknowable man she'd ever met knew she took her coffee black, and whether that was something she should be concerned about or something else entirely. She was still working on that question when things got complicated. The complication arrived in the form of an email from Callaway's legal team. They were filing a civil suit. They were pursuing recovery of the misappropriated funds. Juniper's name was on the filing, $43,212, plus interest, plus legal fees. She read the email twice. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She printed it because she thought better when things were on paper, and she carried the paper to the window and stood there for a while looking at the city, which was enormous and indifferent, and full of people who had no idea she was standing here, trying not to feel like the floor was tilting. She didn't want to tell Voss. She didn't know why, except that she'd been handling things herself since she was 9, and stopping now felt like a kind of failure. But she also understood numbers, and this number, the combination of legal defense costs against her current savings, was not in her favor. She found him on the 14th floor, which was different from the 16th in ways that took her a moment to name. Quieter, darker wood, more people. Men she didn't recognize who stopped talking when she came in, and who looked at her in a way that was assessing without being rude. She'd learned that look in her first 3 weeks, had decided it was the organizational equivalent of a security check. Voss was at the end of the hall, standing at a window with his back to her, talking to a man she'd never seen before. He turned when she appeared. The other man looked at her. Voss made a small gesture, and the other man left without being asked twice. "Falk," he said. She held out the email, printed on paper, slightly crumpled from where she'd held it against her palm, walking through the building. He took it. He read it. He read it the way he read everything, without visible reaction, his face doing nothing at all, the way hers did when she was looking at numbers she hadn't expected. When he finished, he set it on the window ledge. "This is Haas," he said. "Dominic Haas, yes, my former, the man I used to date, who had access to my desk. You're certain?" "I'm not certain of anything I can prove," she said, "but yes, I'm certain." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the email, not at her. "This goes away," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry. The suit. It goes away." He looked up then, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, or hadn't recognized before, not warmth exactly. Something more deliberate than that. Something that was making a calculation and had reached a conclusion. "Haas works for a client of mine. Has for 2 years. I was not aware of his other activities." A pause. "I am now." She stood very still. The city was still there, beyond the glass. The afternoon light was making long shadows on the floor. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means I have information he would prefer I didn't have." Another pause. "It means the suit will be withdrawn within the week. It means the funds will be returned to the accounts they came from, and it means that Dominic Haas will be having a very difficult quarter." She should probably have asked more questions. She probably should have been more alarmed by the specificity of what he was describing, and by the calm with which he described it. But she'd spent 11 days being furious and scared, and standing in this room, looking at this man who spoke about Dominic Haas's very difficult quarter the way you'd speak about a math problem you'd already solved. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. Actually looked at her, not at the email or the window, or the middle distance he usually seemed to occupy. At her specifically, at the way she was standing, which she suddenly became aware of, too straight, hands in her pockets, chin up the way she held it when she was trying not to show that something had gotten to her. "Because you work for me," he said, "and I don't let things happen to people who work for me." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's not a reason." "No," he said. "It's not the whole reason." She waited. He picked up the email from the window ledge, folded it once, held it. "You've been here 6 weeks, he said. "You found 3 errors in the Q3 ledgers that my previous accountant missed for 8 months. You came to me with the Callaway suit instead of trying to handle it yourself, which took more sense than most people have. You drink bad coffee at 7 in the evening without complaining about it, and you ask the right questions instead of the easy ones." He paused. "I notice the people who work for me, Falk. Some of them I notice more than others." She didn't say anything for a moment. There was something in the room that hadn't been there before, a shift, a change in pressure, the way the air feels just before weather. "I'm not interested in complications," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "As a general rule, then what are you saying?" He handed the email back to her. "I'm saying the suit disappears. I'm saying you keep working. I'm saying I notice things. And one of the things I notice is that you've been in this building 6 weeks, and you haven't asked me once who I am or what this company actually is. which means you already know enough to have figured it out." He met her eyes. "And you're still here?" She was still here. She took the email. She looked at it. She thought about what she'd figured out in 6 weeks, the nature of the clients, the structure of the accounts, the way men moved through this building, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms. She thought about what she'd chosen not to ask, and what that choice had meant. "I'm still here," she said. He nodded, as if that was the answer to a question he'd been holding for a while. "Good," he said, then, "the monitor's on your floor. Do you need a third?" She almost laughed. "Almost. No, all right." He moved toward the door, not rushing, just done with the moment in the way he was always done with moments, with the particular efficiency of someone who doesn't waste time he could be using for something else. "The suit will be withdrawn by Thursday." "Voss," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "not for the business reasons, for the actual reason." He was quiet for a beat. She couldn't see his expression from where she was standing. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't gotten to the complicated part." The complicated part, she would learn later, had already begun. The suit was withdrawn on Wednesday, not Thursday. She got the email at 8 in the morning and sat at her kitchen table with her tea and read it 3 times. The language was terse and lawyerly and said almost nothing, but what it said was that Callaway Financial Partners was dropping all claims pending new information. By Friday, she'd heard through a former coworker, a woman named Tess, who texted her sometimes and had nothing to do with the accounting department, that Dominic Haas had been placed on administrative leave. By the following Monday, he was gone. She didn't ask Voss what had happened. She understood implicitly that asking was not the same as knowing, and knowing was not always useful. What she knew was that the problem was gone. What she knew was that the man responsible had been removed. What she knew, and this was the part she kept turning over, at night, in the particular silence of her apartment when the radiator was quiet, was that Voss had done it not as a business calculation, or not only as a business calculation, but because of something else. Something he hadn't named directly, but had been specific enough about that she couldn't pretend she'd misheard it. He noticed her, more than others. She was 31 years old, and she had spent most of her life being the person who noticed things, who caught the errors others missed, who read the numbers that told the truth nobody else wanted to hear. She was not used to being the thing that was noticed. She told herself it was complicated. She told herself he was her employer. She told herself she had, in fact, figured out what this company was, what he was, and that any reasonable person would maintain a professional distance from a man whose industry she understood mostly through careful inference and deliberate not asking. She told herself all of this. She also stayed until 7 most evenings. She also knew now that he stayed later. The second time he left coffee on her desk, he stayed. He sat in the chair across from her workstation, the one that was there for no good reason she'd ever identified, since she didn't have meetings in her office. And she kept working for a while because she wasn't sure what else to do, and because the work was actually at a critical point, and because there was something strange and oddly comfortable about having him there. He wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't performing the way people sometimes performed when they wanted something. He was just present. In the particular way he was present everywhere, completely. "You grew up in Bakersfield," he said at some point. She didn't look up from the screen. "You read my file. I read a lot of files. And you remember Bakersfield. I remember everything in the files that matter." A pause. "Why accounting?" She considered the question. Most people, when they asked it, expected something ambitions adjacent, a story about numbers being her passion or finding her calling. She'd given that answer so many times it was almost automatic. "My mother couldn't read spreadsheets," she said instead. "We got into trouble a lot because she couldn't tell what things cost or what we owed or how much longer we could stay in a place before it became a problem. I learned to read them for her. By the time I was 12, I was filing her taxes." She finally looked up. It wasn't a passion. It was survival. He was watching her with the particular stillness he had. Not blank, not absent, but the way you get still when you're actually listening. And then it became something else, he said. Then it became something else, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. My father kept his books in a ledger, actual paper, green ink for income, red for expenditure. He wouldn't put anything in a computer until the year he died. A pause. He was the only person I've ever seen make paper books faster than a spreadsheet. She stared at him. In 6 weeks he had told her nothing about himself that wasn't operational. You had a father who did bookkeeping. Everyone has a father, he said, with something that might have been dry humor if he'd had more of it. Mine happened to be good with money. What did he do? The same thing I do, he said. More or less. She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar on his right hand, at the grey at his temples, at the way he sat in a chair in someone else's office, like he'd decided the chair was his and was simply allowing her to be nearby. How long have you been doing it? She said. Long enough, he said, that I notice when someone is genuinely good at this and when they're performing it. He met her eyes. You're not performing. Neither are you, she said. Something changed in his face then, small, but she caught it. She was good at catching things. A softening, maybe, or a stillness of a different kind. No, he said, not with you. The radiator in the office clicked. Outside, 17 floors down, the city moved the way cities move. Indifferent and continuous and full of people who were not sitting in this room, in this exact configuration, trying to figure out the distance between what was practical and what was already decided. She should maintain professional distance. She'd told herself that. She also knew, the way she knew numbers, immediately, with certainty, without the need to run the calculation twice, that professional distance was not what was happening here. The complicated part you mentioned, she said. Is it complicated because of who you are, or because of who I am? Both, he said. That's honest. I'm always honest about problems, he said. I'm less honest about solutions. She looked at her screen, at the numbers that were still there, mid-calculation, waiting for her to come back to them, at her own hands on the keyboard, which knew exactly what to do with columns of figures and were considerably less certain about everything else. We could call it a problem, she said, and not solve it. We could, he said. Is that what you want? She thought about Bakersfield, about the kitchen table, about the version of herself that had learned early that the world was not going to make things easy, and that the answer was not to wait for easy but to read the room. Really read it, all of it, the comfortable parts and the complicated ones, and decide with full information. She had full information. No, she said, that's not what I want. He nodded. Deliberate, then we don't, he said. Outside, the city kept moving. On her screen, the numbers waited, patient, precise, unchanged by the fact that the room had shifted, that something had settled into place the way things do when the last variable resolves and the columns finally, after all the corrections and all the careful work, come out even. She went back to the numbers. He stayed in the chair. The coffee was still warm.